and in particular hallucinations, delusions, that kind of thing. I just want to make a statement that, again, the time is short, so my intent is really just to provide an overview, and then I have a lot of references at the end of the PowerPoint, which I'm sure you'll get, so that it'll kind of direct you through some of these sources. And also during your consultations, you can check in with the various consultants who are working with you for more details about it. So with that, moving on to why are we doing this? And this is kind of a standard stat that's been presented out there. Why training coping skills? Well, the reality is that a high percentage of folks with schizophrenia and psychotic symptoms, even when they're taking medicine, fully adherent, will continue to experience symptoms. All right, and so with that persistent symptoms, we want to be able to kind of help folks manage that, cope with that in some way. In thinking about developing coping strategies, it's not as simple as like, here's one strategy and this is what works. We need to have kind of a guiding framework and kind of a whole perspective on it, if you will. So I wanted to start with what do folks who experience psychosis want, or what do they report that they want? And this is from Bravin et al. And the Schizophrenia Commission. And it's really got a couple of main points which we're all familiar with. To be listened to have experiences validated. So we need to keep that in mind when developing coping strategies. To be seen as a person, communicate hope, to have choice and collaboration in treatment, regain a sense of self, and rebuild lives with optimism. So those are the kinds of things that are coping strategies. When we're thinking about developing those things, that's our goal. All right, moving forward. So in terms of doing or teaching any kind of strategy, the first piece is always engagement and alliance. It's always the most critical first step to build a safe and supportive relationship. That's always number one. From this safe place, help the individual increase confidence, both in communicating about the experience and then managing symptoms. And I really like this quote from the Herman Doeg's The Stop Manual, and that is perhaps the most important component of this phase is to really care about what the young person is experiencing. All right, the Stop Manual is a manual for first episode programs for folks who are experiencing persistent symptoms, but I think it kind of captures that. And we know from some of the research that if you don't have a good alliance early on, the outcomes tend to be negative with first episode programs. So before mastering techniques or strategies, it's really about how to build that relationship, that rapport, that collaboration is really always the first thing. In terms of where these strategies come from, they come from CBT for psychosis and a bunch of other places as well, including folks with lived experience. In formal CBT, the task is to develop a shared understanding of the person's experience first, and that's that listening and trying to get a sense together of what's going on. And an example of this would be, what are the events that typically lead to the experience of symptoms? Look for links between thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and then developing coping skills based on this understanding. Today's training is not going to go into formulation, and it's not going to go into the engagement strategies that was covered back on March 22nd. Actually, we had a thing on engagement that Dr. Val Kreider did. So look back to those notes around ideas for building engagement. And today I'm just going to talk about some ways to potentially assist in coping with psychosis with some emphasis on normalization and education. We'll talk about stress vulnerability. And coping, and again, to repeat, there's no single set of skills, rather there's kind of a range of strategies with the intent to kind of build mastery and confidence. They tend to fall into some categories like reducing stress and tension. One category is often referred to as distraction, or we talk about as choosing a preferred or valued activity. And then another set of strategies are focusing or exposure-based strategies, which means facing the distressing experience, the voice, or whatever the distressing experience might be. Okay, so for the first category, normalize and educate, the primary strategy we use is really helping folks to understand the interaction of stress, biology, and life experience. And the idea here, this is a stress vulnerability model, and most of the folks in the room here and the names that I've seen on the screens have attended the trainings where we talk about stress and vulnerability, that for any of us put under enough stress are likely to experience some sort of distress or some sort of symptom. The type of symptom or distress we experience is based largely on our own particular vulnerabilities, our own biology, and our own experiences. And so how do we communicate this idea? Wait for it. The stress bucket. So many folks are familiar with the stress bucket. And this is a tool or a strategy that is used to communicate this idea of the relationship between stress and symptoms we experience. And the basic model is that of a bucket, and the idea of stress pouring into a bucket. And as the bucket overflows, the person experiences symptoms. All right, I'm going to move to the picture to explain the rest of it. So this is a handy image developed by Dr. Val Kreider with all the colors and forms on here to kind of help explain the model and to use it as a working form. So the bucket represents all of us and how much stress we can contain. And so some of us have really big buckets, smaller buckets. Some of the buckets are really tightly held together. Others have some soft spots, things like that. But for any of us, we experience stress, and the stress is the water going into the bucket, and they can come from interpersonal places, more general work stress, those kinds of things. And as stress overflows, we have symptoms. All right. So the basic idea here is that even, say someone who's prone to headaches, with enough stress, they're more likely, when they have enough stress, the overflow would be a headache. For another person, it may be hearing voices. For another person, they may become more paranoid. So it applies across the board for folks, and that's what makes it a really nice normalizing model. So understanding that piece, we can talk about, well, so if that leads to symptoms, what kind of things might help? Well, if we can reduce the number or amount or frequency of stress, that would help. If we develop coping skills that would release some of the stress so there's not overflow, that would help. And I like the particular hose that's on the left of my screen, the green hose there. That kind of reflects strategies that we use that we think help reduce stress, but actually adds more stress to the bucket. So substance use or other kinds of things, we sort of think, oh, maybe that helped in the moment, but over time it just adds more stress to the bucket. The bindings around the bucket we've referred to as resilience. We used to just talk about stress vulnerability, but more and more we're talking about resilience. And so we try to build into this model the idea that no matter what we've experienced through our lives, we've developed certain areas of resilience, certain strengths. And so we wanted to build that into the model. So having gone through certain things, how has that made you stronger? And try to look for those kinds of things. And so this would be an example of a kind of generically filled out stress bucket with some of the things that I mentioned. And in the resilience area, it could be things like compassion, patience, empathy, ability to communicate, maybe a spirituality that's supportive for you, those kinds of things. And we found this to be a helpful tool to work individually. Some folks on first teams have actually made a big version of this and used it in group. And again, it's a nice model that applies across psychotic symptoms, medical symptoms, any kind of issue this can apply. All right, so we like that from a normalizing standpoint. So that's one of the big categories that we use in terms of education and a tool that we use to kind of help folks have a framework to talk about their symptoms. So even if they don't want to talk about voices or don't want to talk about having schizophrenia, that's okay. What's distressing, what adds to the stress, what reduces the stress. It's a safe place to kind of talk about things. All right, I'm going to move to working on coping with distress caused by voices. Just a little introduction. Voice hearing can start very suddenly, and it can be very shocking and obviously off-putting. For those of you who have been in the trainings where we do a voice hearing experience, it's very powerful that you really get the sense of how strong a voice hearing experience can be and how disruptive it is. In addition to the experience itself, beliefs about the voice can affect it, and behaviors that folks choose after hearing or having the experience of voices can also make it difficult. So for instance, folks, when they're overwhelmed by voices, will often limit the number of coping behaviors that they use. They try to find a couple things that seem to work. And there can be a tendency to use safety behaviors. And by that, I mean avoiding the experience, isolating themselves, doing things like wearing hats, earplugs, foil, different kinds of behaviors which in their mind help them sort of deal with the voices, but they're really kind of avoiding it in some fashion. And the overuse of these kinds of strategies has been found to lead to more distress over time. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. I jumped ahead of myself a little bit. There are certain beliefs about voices that contribute to distress, such as voices are all powerful and that a person has no control over them, or that voices know everything or intend to help or harm. And the reason this becomes important is that if people really feel like they have no control over their voices and conclude that, then they can get into a very passive, sort of helpless position around that. And so a lot of strategies are really intended to help folks understand and see where they have influence. And maybe not total control, not be able to shut it off completely, but they can influence, which kind of gives a sense of some power and some mastery over voices. And so that's one of the intents with some of the coping strategies. Okay, so in terms of talking about voices, remember the first step is to create that safe place and a environment where it's okay to talk about voices. And so a curious, respectful attitude, not shocked by the experience of someone hearing voices. almost matter of fact, if you will, so that it's kind of okay to talk about it and not have stigma attached to it. Some authors have talked about if you need to formally kind of give the person control, you can use something like a hand signal, like if you want to stop talking about voices, just let me know in some fashion and we'll stop. All right, and we can just kind of do it that way is one of the tools. And again, so you can kind of see that sense of how do you empower the person, make it safe and comfortable. The other strategy we referred to earlier about normalizing. In this case, I'll talk just a little bit about the commonness of voice hearing and famous voice hearers. So in this regard, how many people report hearing voices that no one else has heard? And the estimate I have there is 8% from Hayward. I've heard estimates that go 10%, sometimes up to 15%, depends on how the question is asked. The issue is that it's more common than a very, very, very rare thing. And again, that's the intent to kind of bring down the shock value or the stigma potentially associated with it. Also talking about, in addition to it not being that totally rare, that there are certain famous individuals that hear voices, Brian Wilson, Anthony Hopkins, some other folks that people would recognize their name and may be surprised to hear that can sometimes normalize the conversation. It's not going to make the voices go away, but again, it's making making it okay to talk about it based on some of these other factors. The other bit of information we often share in trainings and with folks we work with is that voice hearing can occur rather commonly in situations like grief. Percentages up to 40–50% of folks who have lost a loved one will either hear their voice, feel their presence, sometimes see them. Sleep deprivation. I often joke if I sleep deprived everybody, for a day or so, we'd all be having experiences out of the ordinary. Certain substances we know can lead to voice hearing. And we know that there's a link between certain types of trauma and the experience of hearing voices. So it's explainable. It's something that's not that rare. There are things that we can do, and it does tend to be something that is episodic, comes and goes. All right. So when thinking about coping with voices, I borrowed some information from Ram and Escher, who did some of the very early work around, how do folks cope with voices, and who did they talk to? Voice hearers. They spent a lot of time interviewing and spending time with folks who hear voices, trying to understand how they cope with voice hearing, and frankly, learn strategies from them. Some of which are available on websites like InterVoice and other places like that. But a couple points that came out in their surveys were the folks who reported coping well with voices were willing to talk about their voices more. All right. And again, that's both sort of comfort, stigma as a way, and allows for you to maybe get different information about voice hearing. Folks who listen selectively or set limits on their voices, and that gets to that issue of kind of power and control a little bit, that kind of stuff. All right, so just a couple concrete things. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. If you would like some ideas about how to ask about voices, what's the voice content, where does the voice come from, do others hear it? And again, these are sort of just curious, normal things. Part of what you're doing is making it okay to talk, and part of it is to bring in other information. So, sometimes we'll talk about if you say the voices come from a wall, you might ask, so if you walk away, do the voices get less, or do they get, do they stay the same? Because normally with sound, it would get less as you move away. You're not really challenging it, but you're just providing information that would maybe get them to think about it slightly differently. All right. When we look at coping responses, we try to go from a strength-based perspective. And so this kind of strategy can be used by folks, any kind of frontline mental health worker. If you have a conversation about the voices and how intense or distressing it is, maybe getting a sense of when does it interfere? And just quite simply, what helps and what hasn't helped? What kind of things have you tried? You're a person with your own agency and ability to do some things. Let's just kind of go from your strength and see what you found. And are you willing to consider other options, some that professionals have developed and some other voice hearers have developed, and so then it's really kind of open for their choice. The two big categories that were originally written about were called distraction and focusing strategies. The distraction, many authors, us included, didn't really like the idea of distraction alone, because the idea of distraction is kind of close to avoidance too. Like, I'm just going to avoid this because I can't deal with it kind of thing. And that's not really the intent. It's really kind of focusing on something you prefer to do. And so this is borrowing a little bit from mindfulness. It's like I notice distress or the voice, and I choose to focus on music, some earphones, a relaxing activity, to call somebody on the phone, something like that. A focusing strategy is putting the attention either into a cognitive focus or direct exposure to the voice. I notice the voice, and I'll respond with calmness and assertiveness. The Anthony Hopkins strategy. I can't talk to you now. I will talk to you from 6 to 6:30 later today. All right, so I'm addressing it directly. I'm setting a limit and a time schedule on the voice. All right, another way to do it would be addressing the negative or unpleasant content. These are just some examples of the distraction strategies or preferred activity. I'm not going to go into details there. One of the things we try to do with folks who try strategies to empower them is to just kind of list the strategies out, and this is just a partial list of ones we've used, and just have them look at it and say, you know, have you tried this? Not helpful, somewhat helpful, very helpful. All right, just to kind of get a sense of there are things you can do, and there's a range. It's not all or nothing. It's not like I have to, you know, this has to work all the way or it doesn't work at all. There's kind of a range of things. Again, that idea of continuum, that idea I have choices, I have some control. And at the bottom of this list, there's a space for what kind of things, you know, have you developed, you know, and so then there's room for them to do their own kind of strategies. Just one example up there that may be a little unfamiliar is reading with or without an earplug. There's a little bit of research around the idea of putting an earplug in one ear and then reading quietly to yourself that will disrupt that pattern of voice hearing, because there's a theory around subvocalization and how the speech and language centers interact with your thoughts. And for some folks who do that, it kind of disrupts that voice hearing process. All right, so just a thought there. And there are a variety of other strategies on a coping strategies list like that. For negative content, this is a super simplified sort of working with automatic thoughts kind of idea, and this comes from Farouk Naeem, as well as Pat Deegan's work. But the basic idea is, you know, what do the voices say? What's true about what the voices say? What's false about what the voices say? What do you conclude? Is a voice being fair or unfair? Is there a healthy statement that you can make related to this, to what you're hearing? And this usually requires some guidance, and we usually encourage folks to get some specific training and guidance around this, because it's closer to a CBT kind of strategy. So we normally recommend this for the therapist or for folks who are working with folks with voice hearing, just to get some guidance and structure around it. All right, but the idea is to not run away from the voice, but to just sort of look at it and say, well, you know what? This says I'm the worst person who ever lived. You know, is that really fair? Maybe that's not so fair. You know, maybe we can kind of think about this differently. A new type of strategy that we're developing here at the Best Center, trying to kind of pilot a bit more with Dr. Velkreider, is mindfulness strategies for voice hearing. And again, this is a whole separate training, but the idea of mindfulness has a lot to do with paying attention in a non-judgmental, non-reactive kind of way. Breathing is usually the focal point of mindfulness. And so in a very simple pattern, it would be focusing on your breathing, notice the voice, return to your breath. All right, and so it kind of trains this skill of non-reactivity, noticing without having to judge it or evaluate it or react to it. All right, and it's getting a lot of attention in the UK, more in the US, and the reference there, O'Donoghue. There's actually a whole manual. It's called Act Mindfulness for Recovery and Psychosis. That's very nicely developed and has very good suggestions in there. And it's so anyway, it's something for you to look at if this is an area of interest. All right, so in brief summary, make it safe to talk about the voices, understand the person's point of view, and if they want to do or make some changes related to the voices, the idea of power and mastery, you know, having the client be empowered to make choices and to notice the change affected by their choices is really important. And that's important in terms of strengthening coping strategies and in terms of working with negative voice content. All right, keeping a track on time. So working with delusions, not sure why we had to bring Freud back in, but just as no one can be forced into belief, no one can be forced into unbelief, which is very true. You know, think of any strong belief that you have, whether it's religion or politics or whatever, and usually confronting or directly challenging doesn't do much with that. And so the same is true for delusions or paranoia. The strategy is very similar. There's listening and normalizing, again, that education piece. For a woman I worked with who had paranoia came back very strongly. We went back to her stress bucket to say, well, what was going on? You know, looks like there's a lot of stress coming out of the bucket. And doing that actually identified a couple of things that really activated the paranoia. So again, you can use tools in combination. The other area with regard to working with delusions and paranoia, often it's an indirect approach. You're really trying to lower distress and improve functioning is the kind of the main way we encourage folks. And you can work directly on the belief, but that's much harder, longer, involves typically more elements. And so the indirect methods are, in short, helping folks identify what they really, really want to do. And Dr. Messamore talks about this frequently in his echo consults, working on stress reduction and emotion regulation, and then improving sleep. If you can improve sleep, it does wonders for all of us, but in this area in particular. The goals and aspirations, there's a couple references there. What do they really want to do is one way to look at it. And working with folks with lived experience and peer recovery specialists, this is what they usually remind me of most often, what's most important, what's the dream, what do they want to keep doing. And then the other part that I really like the Beck group has really talked about is looking for the client's adaptive mode. And the grant reference 2014 is really pretty good. It's kind of just asking, when are you at your best? What are you doing? When are you at your best? And looking for that mode that's more adaptive, more active, and just kind of growing from there. And the idea is that if you can get folks to do either of these two things and they start doing them, the beliefs will change as a result of doing some of these things. All right, so you kind of work from the behavior back to the beliefs. Again, this is just repeating, lowering distress through relaxation, emotional regulation strategies. Again, the key is not any specific strategy, but the one that kind of helps folks relax and feel in more control of their emotions, or strategies to improve sleep. If you're going to work directly with regard to delusions, and again, this is not a coping strategy like you're going to do this and it's going to change it, but this is just a mindset and an approach when talking with someone about a firmly held belief. And I have the references by Amador and Hazel Nelson there below if you want to look into more detail. But the perspective is usually empathy, number one, whether it's true or in fact or not, it's experienced as factual by the person, so really from their situation and their point of view. How would I like someone else to respond to me if this were true for me? Suspend disbelief and explore in a neutral, curious way. So you're not challenging or agreeing. You're really just trying to understand where they're coming from if you're going to try to go down this path. Asking questions to better understand. We call these eyewitness testimony type questions. So help me understand, when did it start? How did you come to know this? Can you give me a couple recent examples step by step? And the idea here is to keep emotion low and make it just sort of concrete and sort of basic to kind of lower that emotional activation, which tends to fuel delusional thoughts. And again, back to how have you handled it, what's been helpful, not helpful, and then do you want to work further. And again, this kind of thing requires specific training and additional guidance, but just to kind of give you kind of the top overview of it. And again, not directly confronting or challenging a belief. Think about how you would feel if someone challenged a very strongly held belief you had about maybe your faith or about politics or something. It doesn't tend to go well, but you can certainly check flexibility of thinking. Have you ever wondered about, whatever it might be that someone may be somewhat paranoid about, or any chance something else may be happening? Or was there ever a time you weren't sure about this, weren't 100% sure about it, maybe only 90% sure? Then you're just looking for where there's room, where there may be some doubt. What do others say about it? What do you make of that? So again, these are gentle ways to respect their autonomy and their belief, but to open up the opportunity to maybe think about it slightly differently. Okay, so I've used the full just about half an hour. So in short, try to create an environment, an alliance where a person is comfortable talking about their distress. Show genuine interest and concrete support for goals and aspirations. Really kind of get behind those things the person wants to do. It means a lot. Help them with the framework to understand their experience, whether it's a stress bucket or whether it's just being able to say, you listed 4 strategies and there's, some work pretty well, some not so well. That gives them a framework to say, oh yeah, some things do work, some better than others, which is a different way of thinking about it than I have no control over what's going on. And then explore what they've tried to see and see if they're willing to build on their strengths and consider options. And usually it's some variation of lowering stress or helping them improve their confidence, sense of agency, the sense of I can do this, and then moving towards goals. And just a teeny piece on the confidence. There's some literature around this, folks. Confidence goes up. It's inversely related with paranoia. So as they get more confident, sometimes that suspiciousness and paranoia kind of goes down. And that's why the strategy of getting folks to be able to do things they want to do and experience some success has this sort of indirect or indirect effect around building confidence and maybe lowering some of that suspicion at times. All right, so the rest of the slide deck has references that you can look to, which I believe will be forwarded on, and I'm happy to get questions from there. Over to the boss.
Boss. I like that.